Hello everybody, I'm the world's biggest Star Wars fan, Sean Star Wars, and today we're going to talk about Star Wars. Well, that's a lie, I'm not actually the world's biggest Star Wars fan, but I have legally changed my name to Sean Star Wars just for this video, so that much is true. No, I am just a mere casual fan of the series. When it comes to the movies, I've seen them all and I enjoy them, even the ones some people don't like, but considering how passionate Star Wars fans can be, let's just say I'm happy appreciating the series from the sidelines. I just want to see cool Devilman do some martial arts, you know? Although, on the other hand, there's Star Wars video games, and let me tell you, I love a good Star Wars video game. Has there ever been a movie, a series, a franchise that's transferred over to the video game medium as successfully as Star Wars has? There are over 100 Star Wars video games released across pretty much every generation of hardware, and you know what? Not only are most of these games pretty good, but some of them are considered all-time classics in their respective genres. KOTOR 1 and 2, Battlefront 2, the Rogue Squadron series, motherfucking Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. No franchise was getting the video game treatment quite like Star Wars, and long may that continue. But today we're not going to be talking about any of those all-time classics, because I'm sitting in front of a white wall with bad lighting, and you know what that means. It's time to rank and review every single Star Wars game released on the PS1, from worst to best. I know, it's pretty exciting. Okay, it's not really that exciting. Alright, you're gonna have to keep it down. I do have neighbors, they're not really into this sort of thing. As always, we're gonna play each game in order of release and give them a full review, and then at the very end, we should be able to determine who are the tops and who are the bottoms in the Star Wars universe. And no, that is not a sex joke. So take a guess, how many Star Wars games do you think came out on the original PlayStation? If you said the number 4, congratulations, you are only 2 off the real answer, which is number 6. Now, since we are going to be doing an individual review of each game, this is going to be a long video, so I have added chapters at the bottom, so if you want to skip ahead to any single one of the games, or even skip ahead to the ranking at the end, go right ahead, you've already given me your view, and at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. So with all that being said, let's get right into it. Can I make an hour-long video using real Star Wars music on the internet without getting a copyright strike from John Williams? Well, we're about to find out, aren't we? First up, we have Star Wars Dark Forces, debuting on the PlayStation in early November 1996. Now, the Star Wars franchise, it's got quite a number of shooter games, although the majority of these normally blend first-person and third-person gameplay, because, as you'd imagine, lightsabers and force powers are kinda difficult to make work in first-person. Out of all of these Star Wars shooter games though, arguably the most beloved are the Jedi Knight series, which follows the story of one of the all-time great characters from the expanded universe, Kyle Katarn, notable for bringing the sexy space beard to our screens a few years before Obi-Wan did. The series follows Kyle from his lovable space merc days to his transformation into god-tier Jedi Knight, and then that other game where you don't get to play as him, unfortunately. The series is kinda cool because you get to experience a sort of journey through the styles of FPS games coming out at the time. The first game, Dark Forces, used a custom engine that's pretty close to what you'd see in build engine titles like Duke Nukem 3D. The next game, Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, then moved on to a new custom engine dubbed the Sith engine, which brought the series into full 3D environments and also added lightsaber duels and third-person gameplay into the mix. And then Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy migrated over to the ever-reliable id Tech 3 engine, which was utilised in plenty of prominent shooters in the 2000s, from Return to Castle Wolfenstein and even the very first Call of Duty. But let's ignore those shiny new games with their third-person cameras and fancy lightsaber battles, because today we're going all the way back to the first game in the series, and the very first Star Wars FPS, the original Dark Forces. And not the 1995 DOS original, which only takes a little bit of hassle to get running in DOSBox nowadays. No, we're of course going to be looking at the PS1 port, which isn't just the first Star Wars game to release on the platform, it's also one of the console's earliest FPS games, and a pretty interesting port too. You see, while the game itself was developed internally by LucasArts, the PS1 port was brought over by a company called Big Bang Software Incorporated, who developed a whole new custom engine to get the game working on the system. Look, they even tell you on the box. Now before we get into the port, which as I'm sure you can tell has its quirks, let's see what the game itself is all about. As we already mentioned, the game sees us taking the role of a former Imperial soldier turned Empire-hating mercenary named Kyle Katarn, who is notably beardless in this entry, I am sad to say. Now while Dark Forces isn't too heavy on the story compared to later entries, it still provides way more than what you'd expect from a FPS game of this era. We've got fully voiced cutscenes, information-packed mission briefings, and appearances from plenty of iconic Star Wars regulars throughout your journey. To give you an idea of how much of a badass Kyle is, the opening level is just you single-handedly blasting your way through an Imperial stronghold to steal the Death Star plans, which he does. So he's kinda responsible for this thing happening. Of course, none of this would have been possible without Kyle's partner Jan Orn, who would also be a series regular from day one. The main plot of this game takes place 1 year after the original Death Star blew up, now tasked with looking into a new type of Imperial soldier known as the Dark Trooper. It's very much a story for Star Wars fans and really showed the benefit of having LucasArts themselves directly involved with the game's development, because they could do so much more with the lore than any third-party developer could ever do. Of course, that being said, if you couldn't care less about all of that and just want to blast stuff, the game beneath it all is also kind of a treat for Star Wars fans. Well, at least back in the mid-90s anyway. Dark Forces unsurprisingly plays very similar to other boomer shooters of the era, from the gunplay and the weapon types to the environments and level layouts. Only now, we've got ourselves a shiny Star Wars coat of paint. Really, the big selling point of this game is that it's a cool genre you know and love, but now with stormtroopers and actual Star Wars sound effects and music. I can only imagine how much of a novelty this would have been back when it first came out. It's sometimes hard to put into context, but if you were a kid who grew up with the original trilogy and played something like this for the first time, this must have been mind-blowing. Of course, today it is notably less mind-blowing, especially when you're playing it on the PS1, but we'll get to that shortly. The game has a total of 14 unique levels, which is actually quite generous considering most maps will take roughly 15 to 30 minutes on your first run through. You can expect to see plenty of Imperial bases, a few different planets, a sewer level, which has a lot of switches. But for the most part, the selection of levels and variety in the environments are pretty good all around. In terms of weapons, it's mostly a lot of different blasters and various thermal devices which all behave as you'd expect. Although some of the weapons also have alt fires in this game too, which would have been quite the novelty at the time. Some weapons are definitely more useful than others, and the game is kind of missing a nice shotgun substitute, but you'll rarely find yourself outgunned, and even if you are, Kyle is literally the baddest motherfucker in the galaxy, so don't even worry about it. Now, while you will get to fight some fun space creatures from time to time, the majority of your playthrough you will be tearing through what can feel like thousands of Imperial personnel, most of which can be cut down satisfyingly with relative ease. Seriously, you murder so many goddamn people in this game, it is crazy. Of course, as the game goes on, it does become notably less easier to kill people, especially when the Dark Troopers start to make an appearance and make your life absolute hell. But yeah, the story, the environments, the weapons, the enemies, it is a Star Wars FPS from 1995. It is old, but damn is it well made and well put together. And to its credit, it even pioneered some groundbreaking features like crouching, the ability to look up and down, and even jumping in an FPS. So if you want to blame somebody for adding platforming into first-person shooter games, here's who started it. This game also has lives instead of quick saves, which is pretty unusual, but I don't know, it works. So the game itself, I like it a lot, although this here is my first time actually playing the PS1 version, which is both simultaneously really good and kind of terrible. On the good side, well, the whole game is here, from the cutscenes to the missions, and once again, squeezing all 14 levels onto a single disc is pretty impressive all things considered. The custom engine added a few new fully 3D models as well, which are exclusive to this version. It's always nice to see Janor flying away after dropping you off for yet another murder spree. Control-wise, it's not exactly the traditional early FPS control scheme that was adopted for most PS1 games, but it is pretty close to it. The D-pad controls movement and turning as you'd expect, and the face buttons control shooting, weapon switching, and jumping. The shoulder buttons though took me a little while to get used to. Strafing is performed by holding a single shoulder button rather than using L1 and R1 like most games. The other shoulder buttons are used for running, which I do a lot of by the way, in case you were wondering why the game looked really fast out of nowhere. Another button is used for looking up and down, and the other is like an alt toggle for crouching and using your secondary fire if your weapon has one. It took a little bit to get used to, but I found it worked well once I had my head around it. Thankfully, the rest of the game's items and toggles can be accessed within a menu where you can equip headlamps and gas masks and even check the map if needs be, which thankfully I didn't have to rely on too much in this game. The sound also got a bit of an upgrade in this game compared to the original, just by the virtue of this being a CD game on one type of hardware versus a DOS game, which had to cater to a wide variety of different sound cards. The soundtrack still isn't exactly full of CD quality rips of Star Wars tracks, mind you, but the music and sound effects do sound pretty excellent in this version, which you love to see.
You're not authorized in this area.
On the other hand, however, the game itself runs very poorly a lot of the time, which actually seems to be the case for many of the prominent PC FPS games that were ported over to the PlayStation in the early years. And while Dark Forces here certainly looks rather primitive by today's standards, this was a pretty advanced FPS when it first came out in 1995. It's not fully 3D, but it's closer to full 3D than the likes of Doom. This is part of the reason why the game needed a custom engine to get it working on the PlayStation, and while it certainly works, be prepared for a whole lot of graininess and a very, very inconsistent frame rate. The game can sometimes go above the 30s or it might drop down to single digits depending on the environment and number of enemies on screen. But even when the game is moving fast, it rarely feels smooth. Although, as you can see, the game has pretty much no draw distance limitations, and likewise the game doesn't let up on the number of enemies or effects either. It keeps it true to the DOS original, but the custom engine clearly was having a bad time bringing this vision over to the PS1. You might have also noticed these black borders at the bottom and top of the screen, which may make you think I'm playing the PAL version of this game, but nope, these are present in every version across every region, which I imagine were implemented to give the game some extra frames that it most definitely needs. Now, I'll be honest, it's hard not to heavily critique this game for its performance, especially given how well the DOS version plays, and of course, we all know how acutely aware we are of frames and performance nowadays, but I'd be lying if I said the game was unplayable. It is certainly rough, but it's still not that bad at all. Like, I'd never recommend this as the version of Dark Forces to play, ever, but if you are like me and have a thing for odd console ports of PC games or console FPS games in general, if you can look past its grainy visuals and let's be kind and say inconsistent performance, this is still a very fun traditional 90s FPS on the console that also happens to be a very good Star Wars game. Although for most people, picking the game up on Steam or GOG will be the preferred option if you want to try this game at its very best. And you should try this because punching Kel Dragons to death really is one of life's greatest pleasures. Hot on the heels of Dark Forces, we have Star Wars Rebel Assault 2, launching on the PlayStation only a few weeks after our first game at the tail end of November 1996. Similarly to Dark Forces, this is another port of a PC game that originally released in 1995, only Rebel Assault 2 is a very different experience to Dark Forces. Well, most of the time. What we have here is an FMV game that offers up a variety of different gameplay types across its 15 levels, all while treating us to some lovely live action cutscenes in between. Of course, being that this game has the number 2 in its title, this is the follow-up to the 1993 original, which itself is also an FMV game, although notably less fancy and also lacking the live action scenes. Rebel Assault 2 doesn't do a whole lot to change from the formula set in the original game, but really none of that mattered at the time because this game was the first time since Return of the Jedi to feature official filming in the series with actors, stunts and effects. And seeing as that's what a 12-year wait to see something new, this was a pretty big deal at the time. Of course, flash forward another 26 years and that accolade is much less impressive nowadays. Live action cutscenes are nice, but it's the game that's gotta sell us, so let's see how Rebel Assault 2 holds up. Now interestingly, even though this is a port of the PC original, unlike Dark Forces which had a couple of notable shortcomings, the PS1 version of Rebel Assault 2 might actually be the very best version. The original on PC definitely looked pretty great for the time on the gameplay front, but the FMV was notably grainy and the sound quality also left a little something to be desired. So this time around, LucasArts tasked the PS1 port with German developer Factor 5, who you may know for creating the Turrican series, working some wizardry with sound compression technology to make games like Resident Evil 2 possible on the N64, or even developing the Rogue Squadron series of games. And I mean, have you seen those GameCube titles? Look how good this looked for 2001, this was insane. So suffice to say, Rebel Assault 2 was in good hands with Factor 5, and as a result, this version of the game features enhanced audio using the original film score, a buff to the resolution quality of the cutscenes, and brand new polygonal 3D models for the ships and enemies, which for 1996 look pretty damn good, I gotta say. Also, you can do this in the speeder bike section, pure tech wizardry at play. The only gripe I have with the PS1 version over the PC original, mind you, is the lack of mouse support, but it's not a deal breaker thankfully. So the port itself, top notch, a rare case of the PS1 version being superior to the PC original. Although keep in mind the game itself is a LucasArts production, and more importantly, it's an FMV game, and we all know how well those aged. So the gameplay on offer here, as I mentioned, kind of the FMV variety hour. Some levels will play somewhat like a rail shooter in space, with you piloting a ship needing to take down a number of enemies to stay alive until you reach a goal further into the level. These sections allow you to control your ship in first person or third person, although unfortunately these parts feature a gripe of mine, which is not including a targeting reticule on the screen in the third person view. But at least the first person view works just fine. There are some cases where you'll play indoor variants of these levels where you're stuck in first person, but that's down to these parts relying significantly more on the FMV backgrounds versus the purely shooter segments. Also, in spite of being on rails, you can also kind of move your ship slightly in these parts to dodge oncoming hazards, which is weird, but it works. Another level variant are these non-combat levels that are all about dodging the hazards appearing in the FMV versus any real enemies. These are generally played in third person and also let you pilot some pretty iconic vehicles from the franchise. Then there's these sections where you're on foot that see you move from area to area, taking cover and popping out to take on stormtroopers that spawn in set parts of the screen. Most of these are in third person, but there is one other similar section that takes place in first person that kind of feels like you're playing a really primitive version of Dark Forces. If there's one thing I can say about these level types is that generally they all look and sound excellent. For 1996, this has got to be one of the best looking and sounding FMV games around, and that goes for any platform, not just the PlayStation. The problem though is that the gameplay that's anchoring all of this together is at best fun but really simple, and at worst it is incredibly frustrating, which is unfortunately a very common occurrence for FMV games, a genre well known for its style over substance approach. Levels can last anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes. You'll play 3 or 4 missions that are exactly the same, only with a different background and enemy model added in. It can be very difficult to aim thanks to the FMV moving in a different direction than your cursor. Sometimes your ship might get sucked into a wall because the FMV rotated in a direction you weren't expecting it to, and there is pretty much no variety to the enemies you'll be fighting. It's a game full of simple gameplay, nice visuals and sound, and all of that annoying crap that you'd come to expect from FMV games. Honestly, on the whole, it's actually a lot better than most other full motion video games that I've played, but that's really not saying much. If you're coming into this game for the gameplay, you're gonna walk away feeling more than a little bit disappointed. Just play Star Wars Trilogy Arcade from Sega instead. It's basically this, but infinitely better. Although, let's be fair, I don't think anybody turns on an FMV game in this day and age expecting a masterpiece on the gameplay front. You're most likely looking for cool mid-90s visuals and some live action cutscenes, and thankfully, this is where the game delivers. I'm not going to pretend like the acting is the best in the world or the story is anything we're analysing or breaking down on a forum somewhere, but this is still a big budget Lucas production, and it is a massive step above what you would come to expect from your usual FMV game. If you're a big Star Wars fan, particularly a fan of the original trilogy, I think you could have a really fun time with this one, even if it's just a play it once and never play it again kind of game. Although luckily that shouldn't be too hard, seeing as the game only takes about an hour to beat, and I'm talking all 15 levels and cutscenes too, by the way. It is brief. Don't let the 2 discs fool you. So yeah, Rebel Assault 2 on the PS1 is a mediocre game, but also a great port of the PC original, and a cool piece of Star Wars history. Can't really say I'd recommend it, but if you're looking at this and think to yourself that you might like it, well, then you probably will. Plus you can do barrel rolls on a speeder bike, so it's got that going for it, which is nice. Up next, we have one of the series' most infamous video game adaptations, Star Wars Masters of Teras, which made its way to the PlayStation in November of 1997, developed by none other than LucasArts. Who would have thought? In case you didn't know, Masters of Teras is a Star Wars take on the traditional 3D fighter, a genre which was very popular at the time. And I mean, come on, who wouldn't want to see Luke and Vader battle it out in a 1v1 lightsaber duel? How could you go wrong? Well, quite spectacularly as it turns out, with Masters of Teras often being considered one of the worst fighting games on the console and one of the worst Star Wars games, period. It also happens to be the only true PS1 exclusive on our list, so that's something. But look, I'm gonna level with you here. In spite of having the internet tell me this game was trash for years and years, anytime I seen it in action, I gotta be honest with you, the game doesn't look all that bad to me. It looks nice for a 3D fighter from 1997, it's got Chewbacca, it's got the John Williams score. Surely it can't be as bad as everybody makes it out to be. So I decided I'm gonna go into this one completely neutral, with no preconceived notions either way. I'm gonna take the time to learn how to play the game well, and have the best possible time I can have with it. So let's see how that turned out for me. Now, on the off chance you're wondering why would these iconic Star Wars characters be fighting each other, well, apparently Darth Vader recruited a fighting expert called Arden Lin, master of a type of combat known as Teras, to hunt down and kill Luke Skywalker, and conveniently, she's gonna do this by entering into a combat tournament, which is essentially a big light side versus dark side brawl featuring a whole host of iconic characters from the original trilogy, and also two characters called Tok and Hor. So there you go, that's the plot. Video games, don't worry about it. The game itself has a decent selection of modes on offer, with arcade, versus, survival, team battle, and practice rounding out the package. Now, the first thing I do when starting a new fighting game is to immediately jump into the arcade mode on the default difficulty and just see how I get on by winging things. This normally works really well for modern fighting games, but older titles, from the 90s especially, it can be a bit of a crapshoot. And let me tell you, it did not go very well here at all. The best way I can describe my first impressions with this game was stiff. Nothing seemed to combo, basic Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat inputs didn't seem to do anything. The only thing I figured out is that R2 lets you take out a weapon, otherwise the AI demolished me, and rightly so. So not off to a great start, but that can happen when you go in blind, so now it's time to head to practice mode. Early on I decided to stick with Luke, cause surely he's the Ryu of this game and will be easy to learn. Well, the first issue is that the game doesn't have an in-game moves list, which to be fair, isn't all that uncommon for early fighters on the console. So that means it's time to browse the manual, but there's another issue. The manual doesn't list all the moves. It lists some, but it wants you to try figure out the rest. Well, thanks to the internet, I don't need to do that, and good old GameFAQs delivers us the goods once again with a full moves list. So a few things about the moves in this game. Every character has two stances, right? One without a weapon and one with a weapon. Depending on your stance, your moves list changes also. Now, guess how many moves Luke has without his lightsaber? 0. Well, that is a lie. Seemingly he has a move that lets him regain health that only works in versus mode, but nobody's playing this with me, so we're never going to see it. So knowing this now, I'm not surprised I got demolished in my first fight, although why even give him the hand-to-hand stance in the first place if it's useless? Am I right? Okay, so now with the lightsaber out, we can finally do some moves. The game's inputs are actually a mixture of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat type inputs, with quarter and half circles and some directional taps for other moves. Nothing too complicated really. There's also a bunch of different combos you can pull off by inputting a string of buttons, which, if you get them perfectly, are very, very strong. And if you've got some meter in the bottom, you can also pull off a variety of different special moves. Some are not that flashy, and others are incredibly flashy and overpowered. So yeah, this has all the basic stuff you'd expect from a 3D fighter, only it's Star Wars, so it gets a few extra bonus points by default. So why all the hate? Well, after learning how to play a couple of characters and trying to seriously get into this game, I think I may know why. So here's the thing, the moves in this game, sometimes they just don't work. You can do the input one time, move comes out. Do it another time, nothing. It's really hard to explain, but the way this game wants you to perform inputs is very slow and delayed. So like instead of doing a quick quarter circle, it wants you to take your time on each individual direction and then hit the attack button slightly after. Take a normal half circle, slow it down about half a second more than you'd usually take, and there you go, that's what the game wants from you. This stuff does not feel good. You could be in the middle of a fight trying to do the most basic projectile attack in all the fighting games, and it might work 1 out of 5 times. I am trying so hard to fire a blaster here, I swear. At least the inputs that involve taps rather than quarter or half circles are a bit more consistent, but not by much. Combos are also very sensitive in this game. Unlike the special moves, you need to tap each command at lightning speed, one button after another. There is very little time to buffer from one move to the next. And I mean they work, but the process of doing them is so stressful, it's kinda hard to keep your head in the game while doing them, and this is just against the AI. The AI, by the way, it's not exactly the scummiest AI that I've ever seen in a fighting game. There's some bullshit from time to time, and also they can be really stupid, but on normal at least, they can give you some good matches. Although, here's another thing, the game, like all great fighting games, has unlockable content, a decent amount of it actually, with 5 new characters and a stage select option to unlock. The problem though, is that to unlock any of this stuff, you need to play the game on the game's hardest difficulty called Jedi mode. And in Jedi mode, the AI actually is total bullshit. This is the mode you want to play because it's how you get new stuff. But as a result, it just pummels any fun you could have possibly had with this game out of your body, and also exposes just how flimsy and inconsistent the fighting game itself actually is. When you really need to perform a move at the right moment and it won't come out, there is nothing more frustrating in a fighting game. You can make things a little easier for yourself by dropping the number of rounds down to 1, but even when learning all the best moves from some of the characters and putting the time into practicing them, yeah, the game is just kinda bad. I had intended to unlock all the characters, but after a 20-minute slog with Han Solo that I think drained a year of my life away, a pummeling in team battle mode, and a pummeling in survival mode, well, let's just say Darth Vader and a Stormtrooper are small consolation prizes at the very least. And I suppose the literal 2-second cutscenes you get for beating Arcade & Hard, that's something too. Although I will stand by what I said previously, I still don't think the game looks all that bad for a late 1997 fighter. The models can be a little goofy and the stages are rather inconsistent in quality, but the presentation on the whole is classic Star Wars. I love the lightsaber health bar, I love the holograms and the character select, the music goes excellent with the fights. There's some nice aspects to this game, no doubt about it. Still have no idea who Tok and Hor are though, but good on them for getting into a fighting game, I suppose. So yeah, after coming in with a neutral mindset and giving Masters of Teras Kasai a fair chance, what do I think? Yeah, it's not very good. Although, is this the worst Star Wars game ever, or even the worst fighting game on the console? Not even close. I think the biggest issue this game has is just how inconsistent the inputs for the fighting are overall. They do work, but they feel very unusual for a fighting game, and combined with the onslaught from the enemy AI, it just made for plenty of frustrating moments. Also, the game is kinda difficult to just pick up and play without studying a moves list beforehand or spending at least a half hour dicking about in practice mode. So I'd imagine most people just trying this game for the first time would have been left with a very negative experience. But when it works, the moves are flashy, the combos look cool, the accidental ring outs are hilarious, and a lightsaber battle between Luke and Vader is still a damn good time. I believe Industrial Light and Magic even did mocap for the game, so this is legit. Although keeping that in mind, there is still pretty much no reason to play this game when the Versus mode from Revenge of the Sith exists. Now that's the premier Star Wars fighting game.
Knockout. You win. Relax, no problem.
Up next, we have what many would consider the biggest Star Wars game to release on the console. Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, making its way to the PlayStation in September of 1999. I think it's fair to say the return of Star Wars to our screens in 1999 was a pretty big deal. Whether you're a long-time fan of the series or just had stocks in the toy business, you were probably pretty excited about The Phantom Menace. Now, how long that excitement lingered upon actually seeing the movie, well, that varies from person to person. My experience was a little bit different, as this was the very first Star Wars movie I had ever seen, and that's in general, not just in the cinema. And I mean, without any preconceived notions on what a good Star Wars movie was, Duel of the Fates and dual blade lightsabers were more than enough to convince an 8-year-old Sean that this was in fact pretty rad.
So blind! You so do not understand! You weren't there at the beginning, you don't know how good it was, how important. This is it for you, this jumped up firework display of a toy advert. People like you make me sick! What's wrong with you?
The Phantom Menace also represented somewhat of a turning point for Star Wars video games, because in the past, they didn't have to worry about releasing games alongside a movie. It was just, hey, let's make a Star Wars game, why the hell not? Now, it was all about getting games out to help cross-promote movies, and that meant an Episode 1 space shooter, Episode 1 racing game, Episode 1 pinball, and of course, Episode 1, the video game. So this here has the distinction of being the official Phantom Menace game that you play if you want to experience the journey of the movie in video game form. And seeing as this is your big release, you'd want to trust this to one of your best developers, and in this case, LucasArts tasked Big Ape Studios with the job. Now, Big Ape may not be a very familiar name to some of you, but prior to working on The Phantom Menace, they did work with LucasArts to develop the beautiful Herc's Adventure, a 2D action RPG for the Saturn and PlayStation, which was generally well received across the board. So it seemed like a safe bet to trust these guys with the big official movie tie-in game. Okay, so a few things went wrong. Big Ape's Phantom Menace game was meant to launch alongside the movie in May of 1999, and that it did. For the PC at least. Yeah, there's actually two versions of the game, and the PC version is, I suppose, the main version of the two, seeing as it's the one that came out first. But where was the promised PS1 version? Delayed. Approximately 4 months to September of 1999. Now, as you can imagine, having the official game of the movie come out 4 months after the movie wasn't ideal, especially when the incredible hype surrounding The Phantom Menace very quickly cooled after the movie had released. Of course, none of this registered with 8-year-old me, who was just very happy to see The Phantom Menace show up in my local rental store one day. And I have very distinct memories of bringing this game home, putting it in my PlayStation, and having what I can only describe as a truly awful time. Now, did I have a bad time because I was a dumb kid? Was the game just too hard and confusing, or was the game just kinda broken and wonky? Truthfully, it was a little bit of everything really. But today, I was excited to sit down and revisit the game with brand new eyes and see if my long-time childhood dislike of this game was actually warranted, and the answer to that is kinda, but also not really. So here's the thing with The Phantom Menace on PS1, it's a very unusual game. It's actually not too dissimilar to Big Ape's previous game Herc's Adventure, in that it kind of plays like a top-down action RPG, but now it's in the Star Wars universe, and it's level-based, and it has one of the weirdest cameras you will ever see in a 3D game. We'll get to all of that shortly, but as for the story and locales, it's Episode 1. You'll be visiting trade ships Naboo, Mos Espa, Coruscant, and even Otogunga. It follows the story of the movie pretty closely, but of course, seeing as it is a video game, it's padded out and features a few extra parts that you won't see watching the film. But on the whole, it is very much your average video game adaptation of a movie as far as the story is concerned. You even get some exclusive CGI scenes, which I imagine looked great in 1999, but now kinda look a little spooky by today's standards. As for the game itself, well, it takes place across 11 different chapters that will mostly see you playing as Obi-Wan, but you do get to control a few other characters as well, including Qui-Gon, Queen Amidala, and Captain Panaka. As you can imagine, the parts where you play as a Jedi are significantly better than when you're not playing as a Jedi, but I do appreciate the variety they try to add. So you might be wondering where the game shares its similarities with action RPGs, because on face value, the game doesn't really scream action RPG, and it mostly isn't in the traditional sense, but the more you play, the more it becomes apparent, and it's not just the top-down camera angle and rather rigid combat The levels themselves are actually quite large and feature a lot of puzzle solving and secrets to find. This includes quite a few side quests that can only be activated by talking to NPCs around the map. If you help somebody out, they might unlock a door that gives you extra weapons and health. Take the time to use some Jedi mind tricks and you may be able to entirely skip some battles or unlock a shortcut to the next area. In spite of the relative linearity in most levels, the game actually gives you a decent number of different ways to approach every situation. Sure, your instincts might just say go in lightsaber first, but oftentimes exploring and taking your time yields better results. The only major outlier in all of this though is the Mos Espa level, which takes place around halfway into the game, which unlike other levels is entirely open-ended with a massive town to explore and a ton of different side quests to take on. This here is probably the closest the game comes to truly reaching its lofty action RPG ambitions, and it's genuinely impressive how open-ended every solution available to you is. Or if you prefer, you can just roam around murdering innocent people and children, you know, whatever floats your boat. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Top-down Knights of the Old Republic, this is not. While this game certainly has lofty ambitions, I feel it's bogged down by pretty much everything else the game has to offer. I suppose now is as good a time as any to talk about the game's camera and perspective. So, firstly, you can't adjust or change the camera in this game. It's basically locked behind the player character at all times. So anytime you turn, the camera will turn with you. It is forever locked directly behind you. Now this can become very disorientating as you'll be turning quite a lot unsurprisingly. The camera also has a habit of getting a little bit too close sometimes, and did I also mention that this game is full of platforming too? Yeah, the camera's not ideal. Although I will give the game some credit, while this isn't exactly what I would consider a good point of view or a camera setup by any stretch of the imagination, it's still surprisingly usable throughout the entire game. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of times where I would have liked a wider view or a bit more control, but it oddly never was too much of a hindrance. That being said, it does require some time to get used to the player movement, which is kinda like tank controls if the world rotated with you. The game lets you walk, run, jump, and if you're a Jedi, double jump. You can also dodge side to side as well, which is a mandatory skill you'll need to master for the levels where you don't have a lightsaber to protect your neck. Speaking of lightsabers, combat is kinda odd too. The majority of the game you will probably rely on your trusty lightsaber, which has a surprising number of different abilities depending on whether you tap or hold the attack button, and also what direction you press while using it. Honestly, only 2 or 3 of these lightsaber moves are really useful, but you will need to master some of these for the boss fights. Otherwise, 9 times out of 10, you can just kill most enemies by deflecting their bullets. You'll love to see it. Of course, you're not just limited to lightsabers though, with the game offering up a bunch of different weaponry from blasters and rocket launchers to thermal detonators and even Gungan energy spheres. I rarely found myself using anything other than the lightsaber when playing as a Jedi, but for the bigger enemies like droidekas, rocket launchers and thermal detonators are a must. Jedi also have a force push ability that's useful for stunning enemies and getting switches in the distance, and that's about it for force abilities, but at least you can push enemies off the ledges. That's kind of funny. So now that we've covered the gameplay from the movement to the combat, it is a good time to talk about the difficulty. You see, this game is very much all about trial and error, and by that I mean the game will literally kill you for going the wrong way. You take a right instead of a left, sorry, you've wandered into a droid army. You didn't know this path would spawn 3 droidekas, well now you're dead. You wandered too far away from your ally character when you weren't supposed to, sorry, that's a game over. Oh yeah, this game has escort missions by the way. Something this game really didn't need. Every level in this game, you're going to come across some bullshit, and while it may be a little frustrating at first, the game does actually have a way to counter this. The ability to save wherever you want. Just beat a tough fight, pause and save the game. Just swapped over to a new character mid-mission, pause and save the game. You're going to want to save all the goddamn time, because dying gives you 2 options, reload a save or restart the level, and some of these levels are pretty long too, so you definitely don't want to be restarting from scratch. I feel this game is almost designed with save scumming in mind. There's parts where you literally can't survive unless you know what's coming up ahead or know the right way to go, and the solution to this is to save a lot. Now this definitely works and makes the game a whole lot more enjoyable, but keep in mind the process of saving and loading isn't the quickest and will absolutely bother the impatient amongst us, but I'll be honest, if you lack patience, this is most certainly not the game for you. I suppose we should talk about the presentation a little, because as you might have noticed, this is a rough looking video game. It probably didn't help that this was Big Ape's first 3D game, let alone the fact that they had to rush to meet the movie's deadline. But even with the 4-month delay, this game desperately needed a little more time in the oven. Textures are very rough. You can barely make out the detail in any of the characters' faces. The game is rife with glitches and weird anomalies, like beating a mission and then having your ally character die while they were literally leaving the level. Expect some weird stuff to happen throughout your playthrough. The sound effects and John Williams' audio is at least, as always, pretty great, and the voice cast, while not the actual actors from the film, do a pretty good job overall, although there's a few audio glitches too, with voice dialogue often cutting out before it is finished. You know, I had never beaten this game before doing this video, and having actually gone through all 11 levels, killed every boss, every box puzzle, one thing is very clear. This is a rough video game. It kind of feels like it is taped together at times. It is full of very unusual design choices, and you'd have a hard time ever arguing that this is very good at all. But you know what, for every glitch, difficulty spike, horrible boss and weird Jar Jar line, there's parts of this game that still really shine through. When a combat section goes perfectly, it looks really great. When you hop around a bunch of droids and blow them up with blasters, it feels pretty great. When you trick a guy into not mugging you in Mos Espa by using some Jedi mind tricks, it's pretty great. There is a good game in here with some great ideas. It's just, on the whole, it is very, very rough. As always, I appreciate when devs try to go against the grain and try something a little bit different, but Big Ape probably bit off a bit more than they could chew given their experience up until this point. And what we're left with is definitely one of the more interesting Star Wars games ever released. I'm sure there's plenty out there with a lot of nostalgia for this game in particular, and considering that I hated this game as a kid, coming back to it as an adult actually made me appreciate it a whole lot more. Just know what you're getting into beforehand, have an open mind, and prepare for a whole lot of Jar Jar. And there is definitely some fun to be had, as long as you're willing to save scum, that is.
Back away slowly and carefully and keep your hands where I can see them.
Futa Zigoba Dataroja.
Next, we have Star Wars Episode 1 Jedi Power Battles, released in 2000, just shy of a year out from the release of the film it pulled inspiration from. Oh, right. Hey there.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Chris from Makopowered. You may be wondering where Sean is, and rest assured, he's fine. He's fine. I just sent him a book on obscure Japanese games as a way to distract him and take over this segment.
So you're telling me you've got to help a polar bear start a music career? Man, what a game.
So, yeah, Jedi Power Battles. The Episode 1 game that somehow manages to be, at the same time, both better and worse than the first PS1 Episode 1 game. Rather than being developed by Big Ape like the previous game, LucasArts developed this one internally, which should give a new hope for this game, right? Well, first things first, Jedi Power Battles is clearly supposed to be a beat-em-up in the vein of The Simpsons, Turtles in Time, or Final Fight. Except it feels like it was designed by people who had a fundamental misunderstanding of how beat-em-ups are supposed to play. Levels are visually interesting and definitely capture the spirit of the locations from the movie, as well as, if not better than, the full Episode 1 game. Okay, great, that's good to see. The problem is that they are way too long. The average level length for the average beat-em-up, like the ones mentioned, is maybe 10 minutes. Not here though. Here levels can last up to an hour each, and there are 10 of them. You do the math. Tied to that, the checkpoints are both weirdly spaced and too far and few between. You can absolutely find yourself respawning into the middle of a crowd of battle droids, which is not ideal. Because of all of this, there is a definite, let's call it ennui, that sets in while playing. It may not be a common complaint nowadays, but these issues make the game feel too long for what it is. Let's look a little closer at what it is, though. You get to pick from a cast of 5 Jedi. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, which makes sense because, they were the main Jedi in the movie. Mace Windu, because, well, Samuel L. Jackson and... Wait. Is this the first playable Samuel L. Jackson in a video game? Yeah, from what I can find, it looks like it is. Unless you want to count the car and Die Hard trilogy, but you could also argue that McClane's driving, so... Yeah, first Samuel L. Jackson. Cool. Anyway, the playable characters are rounded out by Plo Koon and Adi Gallia, just to make sure there's some Star Wars alien flavor, I guess. Once you've selected your Jedi of choice, you then proceed to get down to the core of what being a Jedi is all about. Whacking shit with your giant glow stick of doom. Now, it's nice to see what they've done with the attack animations here. Unlike in the last game, where swinging your lightsaber looked like a 5-year-old swinging a wiffle bat, now your attacks actually look like the ones in the movie, with all of the flourishes and spinning that entails. There are a few problems with that, though. First, while the animations are fun to watch, they are also locked in. Once one starts, you cannot cancel it if you need to dodge, or block, or change direction if the enemy moves. This means that you will, without question, leave yourself open to damage that would have been avoidable in a regular beat-em-up. Also, these animations lead to a unique requirement for this game, a lock-on button. Sure, this was still the early days of 3D gaming, and yeah, Ocarina of Time made lock-on buttons fashionable, but most of this game is presented from a 2.5D perspective, so attacks really shouldn't need a lock-on button. But here we are. And trust me, it is very much a necessity, as proven by this little snippet of gameplay where I literally could not hit a battle droid standing right next to me because the animations would repeatedly carry me past it without affecting it. The biggest problem though is that these moves aren't particularly effective, largely because neither are the lightsabers themselves. Because the developers wanted to keep the traditional beat-em-up feel here, regular battle droids take at least 4 to 5 hits with your lightsaber. A far cry from the hot knife through butter effect of the film, and other more specialized battle droids can take even more damage. Also, let's just stop and appreciate this for a moment. How can a battle droid block a lightsaber attack? Repeatedly! Oh, once again, the lightsabers have no effect on Jar Jar. Trust me, I tried. Multiple times. Although, here's a pro tip. When fighting the boss monster in the Swamps of Naboo level, stand behind Jar Jar when the monster spits its homing attack at you. Jar Jar will shield you, and neither of you will be any worse off for it. Speaking of blocking, there is significantly more nuance to it here than in the prior game. In that game, you just held down the attack button, and you'd automatically bounce blaster shots back. Sort of. Long story. Anyway, here you can still bounce shots back at the attacking droids, but you don't do it by holding down the block button. Oh, yeah, there's a dedicated block button now. Instead, you need to time hitting the block button just right, which will then bounce the bolts back at the droids who shot them, causing significantly more damage than your lightsaber. Seriously, after realizing the disparity in damage between basic lightsaber swings and reflected shots, I just started relying on reflecting shots instead of actually attacking. Battle droids, destroyer droids, bosses, reflecting shots at most, if not all of them, is perhaps the most effective strategy in the game. Well, at least for the fighting, at any rate. I say that because, for some reason, the developers decided to insert platforming into the game as well. Now, on the surface, that doesn't necessarily seem like a bad thing. The problem here is with implementation. First, there's a small issue with basic movement, which makes platforming in this game more difficult than it should be. See, when a character changes direction, they don't pivot in place. Instead, they turn in an arc, even if they are standing completely still. Why is this a problem? Because the developers have back and forth platforming, where the platforms leave no margin for error. This means that you will inevitably fall off of these platforms while trying to turn around to jump to the next platform. Okay, that's frustrating, but not something that can't be worked around, right? Yeah, that would be the case, except for one other thing the developers added to the platforming for some reason. Fall damage. That's right, fall from a high enough height, and it's instant death. Combine that with the issue of the turning radius, and frustration turns to anger, which leads to hate. Except here the suffering comes first. This problem is particularly keenly felt, again, in the swamps of Naboo, which is both platforming heavy and rife with bottomless pits. Hooray. To be fair, to make up for that level, the next level allows you to commandeer one of the droid tanks and just go to town. So there's that going for it. So, okay, the game is definitely flawed, but I can appreciate the attempt, if not the execution. The really interesting thing about it, though, is that it highlights how George Lucas got around a fundamental moral quandary present in the original trilogy. Let's look at the rank-and-file enemies in the game for a moment, outside of Tatooine and Coruscant, which I didn't get to, but I'll explain why in just a bit. Anyway, you've got droids, and more droids, just like in the movie. Now, let's compare that to the original trilogy, where the rebels killed wave after wave of Imperial stormtroopers. Yeah, they all wore dehumanizing helmets, but that doesn't change the fact that the rebels killed a lot of real people. In other words, the violence in Episode 1 and this game is okay, because you're only attacking machines. This idea is highlighted, once again, in the swamp level. While you can't hurt Jar Jar, you can hurt some of the other swamp animals. The game doesn't want you to, though, and penalizes you if you do, suggesting an attempt to maintain the reverence for life that a Jedi is supposed to uphold. This kind of goes out the window when you get to Tatooine and Coruscant, though, when the game throws sand people and mercenaries at you respectively. I mean, I get it, the droids weren't present on either of those planets, and there was zero action on Coruscant, which took up a good 20 minutes of the movie. Given that, though, A, why make Coruscant a level in the first place then? And B, the player winds up killing as many sand people as Anakin in Episode 2, if not more. Maybe that's why Adi Gallia has a red lightsaber. Oh, yeah, let's nerd out and talk about that for a second. There are 5 Jedi in this game, all wielding their death flashlights, but only 2 of them actually used theirs in the movie, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. So, where did the colors for the others come from? I can actually explain this, for better or worse. See, Mace Windu has a blue lightsaber instead of his iconic purple one because the Episode 1 preview figure that Kenner released gave him a stock blue lightsaber. Fine, makes sense. Plo Koon has a yellow lightsaber because, I mean, why not, I guess? He gets a blue one in the next movie, but whatever, it's fine. Adi Gallia, though, her lightsaber color has changed repeatedly, going from green to blue, but in her initial figure for Episode 1, it's kind of hard to tell whether it's a maroon or magenta, or if it's, well, red. The manual for Jedi Power Battles states outright that it's crimson. There's just one problem with that. Only one type of Force user has a red lightsaber, and it's not a Jedi. I mentioned that I didn't get to the Tatooine and Coruscant levels of the game, and let me tell you why. First, as mentioned, this game is too long for what it is, especially after playing through the prior Episode 1 game to completion. Second, during one of my recording sessions, I discovered a fun little quirk the game has. When selecting Jedi, there's some info beside each of them, including level and skill. The level isn't referring to experience level though. That's what skill is. Instead, it's referring to progress in the game. Yeah, that's right. You cannot switch Jedi from level to level. Each Jedi has to unlock each level on their own. Padded replayability. The third reason, though, was the deal breaker. I was playing through the Naboo Palace level, which, again, was way too long. I kept dying at a certain checkpoint, and found myself needing to go through a particularly tough and glitchy section of the game. In one attempt, which would turn out to be my last, I was doing well enough that I left a full health power-up in the Queen's throne room in case I needed it later. Which I did. I ran back to get it, and got locked in the room. Normally, when you first leave the room, it's because the Queen unlocks the door for you before running forward to head to her ship. She wasn't there when I went back, for obvious reasons, but the game still wanted her to unlock the door for me. So I was trapped with no way out but to reset the game, or turn it off. Guess which one I did? By the by, Jedi Power Battles is an interesting take on the prequels, just a particularly flawed one. This idea for a Star Wars game wouldn't come into its own until Ubisoft, of all companies, decided to go full-on retro with their GBA and DS versions of Revenge of the Sith, games that are woefully underappreciated for what they are. Uh-oh. I'd better go now, because it looks like Sean reads faster than I was expecting, but Thanks for watching and not ratting me out.
And now it's time for the final game in today's showcase, and that's Star Wars Demolition, which made its way to the PlayStation in November of the year 2000. Out of all the games we've seen today, this is the one I knew the least about, other than the fact it's a Star Wars vehicular combat game, which, in fairness, on paper could be pretty good. Who wouldn't want a Star Wars take on the Twisted Metal formula? Although, let's hold the phone real quick, because technically this isn't a Star Wars take on Twisted Metal, but a Star Wars take on Vigilante 8. You see, the developer of this game, Luxoflux, were also responsible for the two Vigilante 8 games that were released earlier on the PlayStation, and I'll be honest with you, the two of these are, in my opinion, the best car combat games on the console. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but at the very least, I always enjoyed them more than Twisted Metal for whatever reason. That being said though, something I've noticed over the years, and I don't know if this is just a personal thing, but any attempt I've made to replay certain vehicular combat games, be it any of the Twisted Metals, Vigilante 8, Rogue Trip, whatever it may be, I found that I just couldn't vibe with them all that much nowadays. I don't know if I outgrew them, if they've aged poorly, or whatever. I just wasn't having anywhere near the fun that I used to have with them, which is a shame because I really used to love this genre of games, especially the Vigilante 8 series. So I guess going into this one, expectations aren't exactly what I would call high, but you never know, maybe this is the one to reignite that spark. Probably not, but maybe. So first things first, as with pretty much every vehicular combat game, you've got a variety of different modes for both 1 and 2 players. You can pretty much play every mode available in Versus or Co-op, which is still to this day one of the biggest selling points for these games. They always shine brightest when played with a friend, which of course means we'll be seeing none of that today, but you can take my word that whatever I think about the single player, it's likely even better in multiplayer. As for the modes themselves, well, there is a decent variety available. Of course, you have your simple deathmatch where you pick a map and your opponent and just go ham until one of you remains as the victor. And there's two kind of throwaway modes. There's Hunt a Droid, where you have to roam the map to shoot as many droids as you can within a time limit, and another called High Stakes, where you make bets against the AI in 1v1 battles until you reach a target quota. Nice distractions for a few minutes, but nothing more than that really. The real meat of the game though lies in the tournament mode, which is a series of 4 battles back to back across different maps, with each subsequent map adding one additional enemy each time to crank up the difficulty. I guess you could kind of think of it like an arcade mode in a fighting game. You pick a character, fight random enemies across randomly selected maps, and if you win you get a fun character specific cutscene at the end. You love to see it. Depending on how quick your battles go, this usually takes anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to do, and of course, you're not just playing through these modes for a silly old cutscene. Tournament mode is also how you unlock new characters as well. At the beginning of the game, you have a pretty small roster of only 6 characters available, and while most of these characters are originals exclusive to this game, not you, Boba Fett, it's not the characters that will be swaying your decisions, but the vehicles that you'll be piloting. You can race around in a land speeder, an AT-ST, snow speeders, and even an AAT battle tank, because why not? Although as you progress through the tournament mode and crank out more victories, you'll begin to unlock even more characters, with the final roster coming in at a respectable 12, adding things like pod racers, speeder bikes, a whole Rancor, and even Darth Maul with his hilarious dual saber blade bike thing. This is so dumb. I love this so much. What's nice is that the game doesn't exist in any particular Star Wars timeline. Technically the story takes place somewhere after episode 1 because Jabba wanted to come up with a new way to gamble after pod racing got banned, which kind of checks out. So you get characters and vehicles from both eras of Star Wars, and this transfers over to the maps as well, with 8 total covering iconic locations like the Death Star, Hoth, Cloud City, and then you've got places like Naboo to fill the prequel quota. So the package on the whole, not too shabby really. It's not the most content-rich example of the genre on the console, but it's certainly got enough to keep you playing for a good few hours, whether in single player or multiplayer. Of course, we're yet to actually talk about the gameplay itself, which is actually where Star Wars Demolition gets a bit interesting. You see, when I first started playing this game, I tried to play it like any other vehicular combat game, which I imagine most would do. Controls are relatively straightforward, you drive like any other game, and you use the R2 button for your lasers, which are essentially your basic attack, and that attack is different depending on your chosen character. And L2 is going to be used for your mounted weapons, which you can pick up off these droid crates that hover around the map, giving you things like thermal detonators, concussion missiles, and tractor beams. Nothing too out of the ordinary so far. Although when I was looking at the controls for this game, I noticed L1 and R1 were used for charging your weapons, and would you believe, that is exactly what those buttons do. If you hold them down, you can charge either your lasers or mounted weapons to one of 4 different power levels, and depending on the level you charge it to, your attacks actually change, meaning that at any one time you have access to 8 different attacks across your lasers and mounted weapons, which is actually pretty neat. All your weapons share the same energy pool, by the way. The different meters on your HUD represent 3 things. The red meter, that's your weapon energy, the blue meter, that's your shields, and the green is your health, and they all function as you'd expect. You do regain weapon energy and shield slowly, but most of the time you'll want to go to the dedicated charge points on the map if things start looking a little bit dicey. Although you also kinda end up as a sitting duck, so try to use these on the sly. The only other items of note are various pickups that can enhance things like your shields or cloak you temporarily, and if you're very lucky, you may even find a droid which will stick to you permanently throughout the fight and can do things like fire at nearby enemies or even repair your ship's health, which is the only way you can do this in game, by the way. So if you pick up R2-D2 at any point, you have truly been blessed. So that's basically a rundown of the gameplay, and while it has its own unique quirks, it's still the usual vehicular combat gameplay that you'd come to expect. Only it isn't. You see, when playing through the single player mode, I noticed a few odd things. For one, I was either doing lots of damage or very little, but didn't exactly know why. I was getting this thing called force multipliers, and I didn't know why. The game kept telling me to finish off opponents when they were down, but I didn't know exactly what that meant. Also, what are these yellow things on the HUD? There was clearly a lot that I didn't get about this game from just booting it up without checking the manual first, because I was finishing the tournament mode, but seemingly never able to earn the credit quota needed to unlock new characters. By the way, to get a new character, you not only need to beat tournament mode, but you also need to earn over 10,000 credits in the process. And dying, using recharge stations, all of this costs you money, so doing this isn't as easy as you'd think. So after 3 failed attempts to make the 10k credit quota, it was manual time, and I'd highly recommend that you read this before playing because this game has some weird systems that you really need to know. So remember charging your weapons. Well, if you hit an opponent with a level 2 or level 3 charge, you get something called force points. These are the yellow icons on your HUD, by the way. Hit any enemy with the right attack, get some force points. Get hit by any enemy with a similar attack, you lose force points. The secret is to get lots of force points and then hit an enemy with a level 4 charge attack, which is essentially your character's super ability. And if you do that, you cash in on your allotted force points and get lots of credits. Better yet, if you take out the enemy, you get a brief moment to get a final blow, which requires you to hit them simultaneously with both a level 4 laser and level 4 mounted weapon attack, which nets you even more big points. The system is not only how you get a lot of credits, but it's also how you do big consistent damage as well. Learning this was like a eureka moment, and it went from me having a nice time with the game to actually really enjoying it. It's very unlike any other vehicular combat game I played, except maybe Vigilante 8, which has something similar called the whammy system, and while it can be a little bit confusing if you go in blind, once you understand how everything works, it actually complements the hit and run heavy gameplay that the genre usually promotes. It's a bold idea to try something a little bit more complicated with a licensed tie-in variant of the genre, but I actually think it makes it one of the more interesting and unique entries in said genre because of it. That being said, the game isn't exactly perfect. It is far from what I would call balanced, with some characters being clearly better than others. Boba Fett, you piece of shit, I'm looking at you. Also, some of the weapons are way better than others too. Seriously, if you get a cloak and proton torpedoes, the AI is donezo. content-wise, it's also a little lighter than some other titles in the genre. Sure, you get lots of cool cutscenes for both winning and losing in arcade mode, but unlocking all the new characters and levels can be done in just a few hours. The presentation is also rather mixed too. While I do like the map designs overall, with Luxaflux adding plenty of their usual gimmicks and destructible flair to the arenas, the old Vigilante 8 engine was really beginning to show its age at this stage, and the game itself is not looking all that hot. Draw distance limitations are pretty noticeable and rampant throughout the game, with the arenas pretty much coming into reality before your eyes. Nothing that ever really affected the gameplay in any meaningful way, but you are gonna notice it for sure. At the very least, the vehicle models and effects look pretty nice though. Look at Boba Fett's little dangly legs. The performance is also a little inconsistent too. The game tries to stick to 30 frames per second most of the time, but it's often fluctuating somewhere in the 20s, especially when you add a few extra vehicles into the mix. On the other hand though, the music and sound effects. Guys, I ain't lying, this is one of the best Star Wars soundtracks that you have never heard. Seriously, there are banger remixes and variations of classic Star Wars tracks, and Luxaflux even throws in a little bit of their 1970s flair that they had with the Vigilante 8 series. The sound effects, as with every game we've looked at today, are on point as always, but really, music-wise, if you're a big Star Wars fan, you need to check this soundtrack out. So yeah, after not expecting much from Star Wars Demolition, I truly really enjoyed my time with this game. It's got flaws for sure, don't get me wrong, but once I took the time to understand the game's mechanics, this ended up being one of the best vehicular combat games that I've played in a very long time. That also just happens to be a cool Star Wars game. Genuinely a very pleasant surprise. And hey, if the graphics are a deal breaker, there's also a Dreamcast version that alleviates things somewhat on that front. So yeah, take your pick. If you've ever been curious about Demolition or were just looking for a very different type of Star Wars experience, you really can't go wrong with this one. Just make sure to read the manual first and don't let Boba Fett run amok, and you will be in for a good time guaranteed. So there you have it, that's a review of all 6 of the Star Wars games released on the Sony PlayStation. And I don't know about you, but in spite of the varying quality of the games that we looked at today, I had a pretty good time doing this episode. There's just something about the Star Wars universe, the music, the characters. It kind of feels like a comfort to me, you know? It's hard to explain, but Star Wars games, they're just nice. But the time for being nice is over, because it's time to rank these games using an arbitrary list system designed by a man on the internet that nobody knows. And that's me, and I'm very important, and my opinion is important. Oh, it actually says here that it's not very important. It's not important at all. Okay, right, I might have misread that. Okay. Well, look, you've made it this far anyway, you might as well see how it turns out. Hit it. To the surprise of nobody, the worst Star Wars game on the PS1 is Masters of Teras, a classic case where having some nice graphics and Chewbacca doesn't really make up for very stiff and unfriendly fighting gameplay. I do think it gets a little more hate than it probably deserves, but there's no denying if you're looking for a good fighting game or a good Star Wars game, this is most certainly not the one to go for, even if it is the only true PS1 exclusive Star Wars game. Rebel Assault 2 is one of the most impressive FMV games I've seen from a visual standpoint. The live action scenes recreate the feeling and vibe of the original trilogy, and the port work from Factor 5 is truly second to none, creating what is in many ways a superior experience to the PC original. But with simple, repetitive gameplay, some classic FMV frustration, and a runtime coming in at a little over 1 hour, this is very much a game that is style over substance. Not something I'll be playing again anytime soon, but if you're a fan of the original trilogy and FMV games, you'll probably get a kick out of Rebel Assault 2 for a single playthrough at least. This might be a contentious position for this game, but coming back to Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace in 2021 is a pretty sobering experience. This was a rough game when it first came out in '99, and let me tell you, it most certainly is still rough today. It's at times a very wonky, unforgiving, and confusing video game with plenty of odd design choices, but at the same time it's also a very ambitious, faithful, and endlessly interesting take on a Star Wars video game. I think you kinda have to fight with it to enjoy it nowadays, but if you can look past the glitches, the endless block puzzles, and the escort missions, there is a fun game here beneath it all, as long as you save scum, that is. Now just in case you were wondering, even though Chris did distract me using my weakness for obscure Japanese video games, rest assured I have played Jedi Power Battles many times, and I agree with all of the major points Chris made. This is a very long, very difficult, very cumbersome beat 'em up that you really feel could have been amazing if not for some very strange design choices from LucasArts. That being said, the game is significantly more polished and visually interesting compared to the Phantom Menace. Those lightsaber flourishes are pretty tasty, let's be fair. Although the one thing that really gives Jedi Power Battles the nod for me is that co-op is class. Honestly, as a single player game, I think Phantom Menace is actually better, but you get Jedi Power Battles going in co-op, and the game really reaches its full potential. The only way to play Jedi Power Battles in my opinion, and the reason why, in spite of its flaws, it takes the number 3 spot on our list. So I just want to clarify, as a video game, I think Dark Forces is the best Star Wars game on this list. It has the best story, it offers a great challenge, it has tons of content, and has arguably the best gameplay out of the bunch. The only thing holding it back is the PS1 port itself. Now don't get me wrong, it's very playable and certainly not a terrible way to play this game, but let's be fair, it is far from the best. Some enhanced audio and new 3D models don't make up for the grainy visuals and very inconsistent performance. If you want to play this excellent game as it was intended, 100% go for the PC original. But if you have a thing for console FPS games and can live with some performance issues, the game beneath it all is still a blast on the PS1, even in spite of its shortcomings, and that's why it deserves the number 2 spot on our list. Alright guys, it's time for a hot take. Star Wars Demolition is the best Star Wars game you can play on the PlayStation. It could use a bit more content, its graphics and engine are starting to show its age, and yes, Boba Fett is a piece of shit, but after playing every single Star Wars game on the console, this is the one I had the most fun with, and I'm as surprised as anybody really. I think a lot of the negative critiques for this game actually come down to people picking it up and playing it like any other vehicular combat game, which is the wrong way to do it. Hell, it took me 3 goes of the tournament mode to start realizing, hey, maybe I'm playing this game wrong. But after learning the mechanics and playing to the game's rules, this turned out to be a very fun video game with great music, fun arenas, and a dual saber cycle. You'll love to see it. And keep in mind, I only played it in single player. If you tackle 2-player with a friend, it's gonna be even better. And sure, the Dreamcast version is the superior of the two, but the gulf in quality between the Dreamcast and PS1 versions of this game is nowhere near as bad as what we've seen with the 2 versions of Dark Forces. At the end of the day, the game that I had the most fun with should always come in at the number 1 spot. And for me, that is without a doubt Star Wars Demolition, my pick for the best Star Wars game on the original PlayStation. So there you have it, that was every single Star Wars game released on the original PlayStation ranked from worst to best. And as I'm sure you will agree, that was a very safe list that absolutely nobody will have a problem with whatsoever. Of course, I would like to remind you that this is just my opinion, and I'm a man on the internet that you don't know, so don't really worry about it too much. But that being said, I would like to know your guys' opinions. How would you rank the 6 games on the list today? drop it down in the comments below and tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm right, or if I have a weird face. Whatever you want to do, go right ahead, I don't mind. And better yet, if you enjoyed the series and would like to see more, why don't you tell me what other kind of games we can do in this video format? Maybe you'd like to see all of the Looney Tunes games released on the PS1. Maybe you'd like to see all the Nickelodeon games released on the PS1. Actually, don't pick Nickelodeon, that would be an awful list. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my buddy Chris for collaborating with me on this episode. Ever since I discovered through his channel that there was a Zelda-style James Bond game on the Game Boy, I've been a pretty big fan of his content. I really appreciate him coming on board to help me with this video, and I'll leave a link to his channel below in the description, so make sure to go and give him some love. There's even a Phantom Menace video up on his channel that features me doing guest narration, so if you ever wanted to hear my voice but with somebody else's words, well, finally we have the technology. But most importantly of all, before we finish up, I'd like to thank you all for sticking with me throughout the end of this video. Whether you agree with my opinions or you disagree, or even if you think I just say words a bit funny, I still think you're a top lad. And don't you worry, lad is a gender neutral term here in Ireland, so nobody is left out of that statement. If you enjoyed the video, a like is always appreciated, and if you want to keep up with more content, subscribe away. I ain't gonna be stopping anytime soon. I've gone on too long already now. I'm in the fucking thick of it, you know? I'll be back real soon, probably with a video on obscure Japanese video games. I just recently read a book about them, and I'm feeling pretty hyped up to talk about more. Until then, thank you so much for watching. I've been Sean Star Wars, and don't forget, fuck you, Boba Fett, you piece of shit.